Hello, everyone. We are going to start with a short film.
Race relations up to 1958 was something that obtained in other parts of the world. And racism was something that obtained, let us say, in the United States of America. But Britain was clean, was pure, was free of all this. It was virginal. That was the myth. But by 1958, when Macmillan was just beginning to say that we never had it so good, and we were having it pretty bad, by that point, the call for labor began to fall off. And when the riots took place in Notting Hill and Nottingham, the profit that the enterprises, private enterprise could make on the basis of exploiting black labor had to be weighed against the social dislocation caused not by the presence of black people, but by the presence of white attitudes towards black people within the country. When those attitudes became translated into acts of racial discrimination, into housing, in employment, in schooling, it became even more difficult to talk about race relations. When those acts then finally became institutionalized in the apparatuses of the state, beginning with the Race Relations Act of 1962, the Immigration Act of 1962, then you begin to have state-sponsored racism. So the subject no longer becomes race relations, but racism.
I don't want first-day discrimination, because first-day discrimination is like giving me crutches after breaking my legs. Don't break my legs. Dismantle institutional racism. I don't want you to lose your racism. Keep it if you need it. Keep it. I mean, if you need to stand on my back to have some sort of stature, you have no dignity, no self-respect, no humanity. Keep it. But don't ask me to give you racism awareness training. Right? I'm not into potty training for whites. Right? I can't wipe your asses. Right? I'm not interested in your soul. I don't care about whether a policeman is racist or an immigration officer is racist. Those things don't matter to me. I want the policeman punished if he's racist. I want the immigration officer's laws changed so that he doesn't examine my sister for her virginity when she comes into this country. I don't want the media and people to have racial awareness training courses. Right. I want to mount campaigns to stop the yellow press from mouthing the lies that create the prejudice, that create the racism, that creates the fascism that kills our people. We don't want to go and be missionaries once again like they were in our country. We are not black missionaries. And there's something wrong about racial awareness training. Something wrong in the thinking. It is asking us to do the same thing that the whites did to us. That we say all white people are racist until they are found innocent. That racism, white racism is something that is genetic, you're born with. What the racial awareness training school says is that even a white person who fights racism is in the final analysis, at best, only an anti-racist racist. It's biological determinism. We are back to a type of fascism that Hitler would have admired. Resistance, in a sense, has always had a time lag. And that is partly because we have never been able to come to terms with the history that we made in order to be able to catch history on the wings and resist at a particular moment of time in a way that we could bring about social change. But the changes have come. They have added up. You don't think the black city bourgeoisie that we have today in this country pulled itself out by its own bootstraps. Right? They rode on the backs of the kids who burned down the city. Right. Even I wouldn't be able to have a job if those kids didn't do things in Bristol and Handsworth and Mosside and Liverpool 8. Right. That doesn't mean that is the way forward, because we need to have a constructive, creative ways of changing society.
On behalf of the family and the friends of Sivanandan, I would like to welcome you all to this memorial. A bittersweet event. the deep sadness that Siva is no longer with us, but sweet because we get the opportunity to celebrate his life, his ideas, and the legacy of the IRR, the Institute of Race Relations, that he developed with others, where are housed the collective memories of the anti-racist, anti-imperialist works and struggles of decades. I feel privileged to have been asked to open this event with Colin Prescod, chair of the Institute of Race Relations. Siva was a friend, both personally and of the monitoring group whom I represent today. He supported our work, again personally and through the IRR, by attending countless meetings in Southall, particularly on racial violence and community responses, and also on communalism. I recall the last meeting he attended at Camden Town Hall when he was not well, but made huge effort to attend. And when I introduced him, he was given a standing ovation, and he joked quietly that he hoped he would get the same after he had spoken. His support and work with TMG, the monitoring group, was born out of a natural alliance because he understood how racism worked, what it meant, and what it looked like at the local, the national, and the international level, and to call it for what it was, whether it was prejudice, discrimination, outright racism, or communalism. And because of that understanding, he could describe and distinguish between the racism that discriminates and the racism that kills. But he also knew how to fight it, the importance of community campaigns and struggles, the communities of resistance, he called them, Southall being one, and the links and the ties that were necessary for us for effective collective action. These terms were not slogans, but they were born from deep understanding and analysis of what racism was, how it operated, and how it was used to marginalize, demonize, and often kill. It was the sharp clarity of this thinking and analysis that enabled many of us to not only better articulate, but also better organize and develop our own strategies for combating racism in the areas in which we worked. He provided the framework for grounding ourselves in our communities, combining advocacy with campaigning. He introduced us to a model of turning cases into issues, issues into causes, and causes into movements. And it is this model we use to strengthen and make effective many of our national campaigns, from the Stephen Lawrence campaign to the Rotherham 12. But we would all rather he was still here today to lead us from the front at a time when we find ourselves, to take a phrase from Gary Younge, when we find ourselves howling at the moon at the atrocities committed across the world to Black people here, the USA, migrants in Europe, and the Palestinians and the Rohingya, just two examples of the extremes of human brutality born out of racial hatred. Today, we are delighted and honored to have contributors from a range of disciplines and backgrounds who knew and worked with Siva over the course of his life, who will share their memories and moments and reflect on what Siva achieved and the great legacy he has left, and who will better express many of these views. And with that, I would like to introduce Colin Prescod, Chair of the Institute of Race Relations.
She was clear, she was sharp, wasn't she? Thank you, Bali. I will say just a few things to underline what I think you've said already. Welcome, everybody. We're here to remember Sivanandan, the special man, Sivanandan. We're here to applaud something of his achievement, and we're here to declare ourselves ready to step up. So I will not make a call for a minute's silence in memory of Sivanandan. Rather, I anticipate a collective moment of sounding off. Although we might indulge a sadness for our sense of loss at his death, there is no place here for any sadness about Sivanandan, and how much he might have left undone. To use the football commentator's language, Sivanandan left it all out there, on the pitch, in the field of struggle. And yet, we still have a sense that there is more that Sivanandan would be doing in these times of global, obscene, anti-migrant racism, these times of rampant populist conservatism, these times when the state's agents and agencies everywhere are every day exposed as not serving the masses. When I say the masses, I mean us, the non-elites. So I think that it is for this that we meet in this celebration, come memorial, to commit to keep on keeping on, inspired by Sivanandan's work and his example, and to recommit to the unspoken pledge that Sivanandan had us all make when he linked arms with us in struggle. The first session is, and I thank Bali for saying all that much more eloquently than I can manage to. The first session is subheaded Siva the Interpreter, as you'll see from your program. It is meant to address the importance, the significance of the ideas that Sivanandan put into play as political interventions in struggle. We're referring here to the manner in which Sivanandan, thinking in order to do, insisted in his essays that big thought and big theory had to be turned into tools for our grounded campaigns and struggles. And the manner in which, catching history on the wing, through his pamphlets, he made analysis of what was going on and how the people responded to what was going on, part of the toolkit of our activism. He produced these as tools. The people who are in this place now, who were younger then and older now, remember the way in which the essays he produced, the pamphlets he produced, were usable directly on the platforms that we were making as we made campaigns. So, in summary, this opening session is intended to address the manner in which Sivanandan demonstrated what Marxists used to call the unity of theory and practice, and the ways in which he delivered rigorous analysis in and for activism. Before I stop, a little personal reflection, maybe an entertaining one, if you will indulge me. I recall with a smile the manner in which Sivanandan enjoyed consciously working what the old sociologist in me might call symbolic representation, where what you got was what you saw, how he looked the part he played. I'm thinking here specifically of how back in the day we linked arms, literally he and I, as the coolie from one British colonial island in the east and the nega from another British colonial island in the west. In harness, appearing on platforms in the USA, in France, in Sweden, amongst other countries, as well as in the UK, to peoples coming out of imperialism's colonial divide and rural cultures. This, our public embrace, mine and Sivanandan's, on platforms, cut right through ethnicity nonsenses and defied those who would divide us against our better instincts. You know what I'm talking about. This was where black was demonstrably a political color of resistance to injustice, not merely a matter of skin tone, and not just what Massa called us. Enough of me. There's a platform of speakers. Want to call them up now, don't we? Gus. No, not Gus. Where is he? Gary. Thank you. Wayne. Herman. Is Herman up here already? Herman. Thank you. First of all, we're asking Gary to say his few words. Thank you, Gary.
On the 30th of April this year, the MP for Tottenham, David Lammy, spoke in response to the Home Secretary's statement on Windrush in the House of Commons. The Windrush story doesn't begin in 1948, he said. It begins in the 17th century when British slave traders stole 12 million Africans from their homes, took them to the Caribbean and sold them into slavery to work on plantations. The wealth of this country was built on the backs of the ancestors of the Windrush generation. We are here today because you were there. Using Siva's aphorism. Now, I doubt that Siva saw much of himself in David Lammy, or that Lammy would consider himself much of a disciple of Siva. And I say that not to diminish or disparage David. They're from different political traditions. And indeed, that's the point. I mention it because it illustrates how far Siva traveled in our politics, how deeply embedded his thinking was, that it traversed a tradition and a couple of generations and ended up in Parliament to help us frame a crisis. Even in his death, he was there when we needed him, and we need him now more than ever. In a moment where the forces of nationalism, capital, and authoritarianism are on the rise and on the march, and when the forces of resistance, socialism, and internationalism are in flux and engaged, we need his clarity, his sophistication, his flexibility of thought, and generosity of spirit. One of the things I loved about Siva, and there were many, was the seriousness with which he took the task that he had set himself. He did not write to position himself or the IRR in the media landscape. He didn't write with a view to currying favor or access. He didn't write with funders in mind. He did not write for a sect or a faction or a fashion. He didn't write for posterity or popularity, and rarely for pounds or pence. He wrote with the singular task of bringing clarity to the moment and providing a framing for the movement or movements, both those that existed and for those he hoped might emerge. This was the Siva who went to the Greater London Council of Ethnic Minorities Unit consultation on challenging racism on the 12th of March 1983 and declared, "I come as a heretic, as a disbeliever in the efficacy of ethnic policies and programs to alter by one iota the monumental and endemic racism of this society." There's nothing wrong with multiracial or multicultural education as such, but it has become the vogue. Government monies for pluralist ploys, the development of a parallel power structure for black people, separate development, Bantustans, a strategy to keep race issues from contaminating class issues. This was not popular in 1983, but it was necessary. And it was an argument I would employ 28 years later in a column explaining that the left has long had a critique of multiculturalism. It just bears no relation to the mythical targets of the right. For in these interventions, Siva was not an honest broker, for the simple reason that he was never trying to sell anything. He was a trusted advocate who put his erudition and prose in the interests of those he held most dear. The black, the brown, the poor, and the militant, and in particular the black and the brown who were poor and militant. I first met him in 1995. I'd been on The Guardian for just over a year and was writing a series on Black Britain 10 years after Broadwater Farm. I'd long known of his work and felt his voice would be vital, so called to see if I could arrange an interview. And it took a few days for him to get back to me. And unbeknownst to me, he had wanted to check me out first and placed a call with Victoria Britton, my senior and mentor on the foreign desk, to make sure that I wouldn't be wasting his time. While others gushed over the very visible, all too visible in fact, during that time, progress that seemed to be emerging for a handful of individuals like myself, it was Siva who pointed out the connection between those advancements and the uprisings and reason why not everyone shared this notion of progress. The people who made this mobility possible, he told me, were those who took to the streets, but they did not benefit. And it was this unrelenting attention to the connections and contradictions between race and class, the need to understand how they engage and intersect, the compulsion not to leave them in isolation, but to view them in their national, international, and local context, which drove me and many others towards him. After that meeting, we stayed in touch. I would pop in episodically, and he always encouraged me. I love the things you write about race, he once told me, but I like it even more when you go off and write about Ireland. In one piece, I described him as one of Britain's foremost black intellectuals, and for a few weeks afterwards, he was lampooned in the office with the initials FBI. He was funny. There was an impish mischievousness about him, which I particularly enjoyed. He took his work and the work of the IRA far more seriously, I felt, or in my company, than himself. And at times he would be deliciously indiscreet, describing one British liberal Indian as a bloody Brahmin, and wondering if a younger colleague who had split up with his girlfriend since the consequent lack of attention was the only reason he could imagine for writing the nonsense that he was writing. I worry, as we sing his post-mortal praises, that he was unaware of quite what a profound effect he had. I sit opposite Aditya Chakraborty, a vital commentator at The Guardian, I believe, who tweeted his appreciation of Siva on his death. And kitty corner from me, diagonally, is Randy Ramesh, now the chief leader writer at The Guardian and also a student of Siva's work. It pains me a bit that David Lammy didn't credit Siva in that moment. Now, I sincerely believe there was no malice or malpractice in that omission. He had a desire to say what he needed to say, but I would have liked to have heard Siva's name in that place, in that moment, and in other places as time goes on. I don't know what Siva thought of the afterlife, though my guess is not much. But I think he would like to know that he lives on in the ideas he has bequeathed to others, whose names maybe he didn't even know, and that will frame the struggles that will bend the world to our will one day. Maybe when we are also all in the ground or our remains spread far and wide, or maybe tomorrow, we don't know. But in that journey from now until then, it's crucial that we say his name and disseminate his ideas so that others may hear it and seek out his wisdom. In the words of Alice Walker, on finding Zora Neale's unmarked grave and putting a gravestone on it, and this I say with Siva in mind, we are a people, and a people do not throw their geniuses away. And if they are thrown away, it's our duty as artists and as witnesses for the future to collect them again, and for the sake of our children, and if necessary, bone by bone. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Sweet. Priya Thermothram.
Nearly 45 years ago, and as a student studying sociology at North London Polytechnic, now the London Metropolitan University, a course which was considered to be the most radical at that time, I and a small group of black students were told in no uncertain terms that race was not a sociological concept and that we'd have to change our dissertations away from a focus on race. It was at that time my friend Len Folks, who's here at the back today, and I got involved with the IRR and specifically with Siva. My work on black identity and lens on black intellectuals was heavily influenced by our conversations with Siva and his easy ability to understand our position in British society, especially given the different journeys we'd each traveled before arriving there. Siva helped us to understand that the stark racism we were encountering, whether on the streets or in the academic sphere, did not distinguish between our respective ethnicities, but rather it emphasized the importance of black as a political color, not the color of the skin. Our conversations also highlighted the role of the black intellectual needing to be not a mercenary on hire to his or her people, but a member of the people's army. Siva helped us to understand that it was around that notion of being black and political and committed to community in its struggles that resonated with both Len and I, and which in turn proved to be the fulcrum on which our lives developed. For Siva, practice was and is the highest form of human consciousness, a process through which every individual expresses the ability to arrive at self-consciousness and self-realization. As an intellectual, Siva's thinking lived through his practice. He was organic to our own struggles, and in the words of Gramsci, was a conceptual builder, an analytical and strategic organizer of ideas, permanently persuasive in helping to guide the moral integrity and fortitude of our own actions. A particular instance of this took place when we were involved in the late 70s in setting up SCARE, the Student Campaign Against Racism in Education at the University of London's Institute of Education. Both Siva and Colin, the latter being an ex-tutor on our sociology course, readily agreed to attend the launch event and provided a rich vein of actions for us to pursue, albeit the end product being the Institute's Center for Multicultural Education, which turned out to be a purveyor of the degradation of anti-racist struggles in education. But Siva's commitment to our struggles never waned, and it's a remarkable testament to him that not being satisfied with simply writing and speaking, he turned to also making his work more accessible through cartoons. I refer here to the 4 booklets, including The Roots of Racism, but also through music in his collaboration with the Asian Dub Foundation, The Color Line, where he reinforced his message about black is not the color of our skin, it's the color of our politics. Siva is a heart where a practice still battles for enlightened social transformation. And to paraphrase Siva, your memory will never die, and we will always cherish and continue to be guided in our actions by your incisive writings and fearless drive to understand and conquer our variegated oppressors. Thank you.
You'll have realized that Bali and I are not giving you long biographical details on the people who are getting up to speak, because you have it in the programs, which I think you've all received. Thank you, Priya. We go back a long way. Next, Musrat.
I feel really privileged to be invited to speak and share my memories of Siva and what he has meant to me. I was fortunate to have spent a year with Siva, Jenny, Liz, Hazel, Danny, Francis, and the extended Institute family in 1991. I too was a young student studying sociology in Birmingham, and my lecturer then, Shirley Joshi, would at the end of the lecture hold up race and class. When it came to my placement year, my brother, who had been involved in setting up the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, encouraged me to spend it at the Institute. As the daughter of a migrant, I was raised in an inner city part of Sheffield during the 70s and the 80s. They were harsh times. As racists rampaged through our streets and attacked our communities, Asian youth formed the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement. Amongst the speeches of Malcolm X and the music of Bob Marley, Siva's speeches were played on ghetto blasters, and his writings were distributed amongst the youth. His seminal essay, From Resistance to Rebellion, became the handbook of our struggle. He was quoted amongst the great black orators of the world. He was our giant. So when it came to the possibility of a small and insignificant me joining the Institute during my placement year, I felt nervous, but also excited by the prospect. It was the time of the Gulf War. I remember at the time, the Institute was a hive of activity. We collated articles for race and class. We monitored the racist backlash, which was as a consequence of the war. We published Black Deaths in State Custody, and we relaunched Calf magazine. We talked endlessly. We planned meetings. We went on demonstrations. I met activists from around the world. I was buzzing. And at the helm, Siva built and steered that ship, and everyone was invited to get on board. He shared his skills, and he taught us how to sail. He made me feel significant. Those times were so important to my political development. He taught me praxis, how to make sense of my world. I learnt oratory. He instilled in me a sense of duty. He inspired me and a whole generation of black activists. He created an army of political soldiers, and he sent us back into our communities so we continue the fight. But as well as remembering Siva as one of the most inspiring black activists, thinkers and writers, I was also fortunate enough to meet someone who was playful. And I remember how he would invite me to sit by his side, and he would read me T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, inspiring in me a love of poetry. We all die, but few of us live on through our legacy. Siva lives on through so many of us. Rest in power, Siva, and thank you for my spark.
I promised myself no tears at this event, but hearing truths from people who really underline the significance of this man is making me feel a little bit funny, Ms. Rand. Thank you. Wayne, please.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Jenny, and everyone at the Institute who have brought us all here today because he was there. What to say about the man who made sense of every case, every cause, every campaign that has defined me and most of my generation? Because as Siva taught us, who you are is defined by what you do, and who you are and what you do transpires in the course of struggle. Siva was an unfailing guide to the terrain and methodology of that struggle. They say you should never meet your heroes, but in this and in so many other ways, Siva was the exception that proved the rule. My overriding memory of my first meeting with Siva was how nervous I was and how prepared I was to meet the great man, to wait for my robust scrutiny that I thought was coming. What I wasn't prepared for was his caustic wit and his sense of humor that left me so thrilled that I got out of that room without wetting my pants. Nor was I prepared for a little job that he asked me to do, some of which I will come back later. I remember one time hesitantly making my way to one of the Institute's notorious Christmas parties, dreading a well-deserved telling off that I knew was coming my way for a now forgotten indiscretion. "Wayne, you bugger," he yelled as I came through the door. "Where have you been?" A swift embrace, a genuine welcome, the telling off reserved for a quieter moment. That was Siva, a man who could tell you off, set you straight, and lift you up all in one sentence. There was also Siva the Star, whose reputation and solidarity could make things happen for you. I remember once I was trying to organize an event to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, and I was getting little support. Siva has agreed to be the key speaker, I said. And immediately, all the support that I needed was suddenly available from all those people who didn't want to speak to me about it a week ago. But above all, I remember Siva the orator, and we've seen a little glimpse of it already today. I first heard him deliver one of his inimitable speeches on the 11th of November 1989. The East is dissolving into the West, he declared. Technology is unleashing new circuits of imperialism that will create new migrants and refugees and give rise to new forms of racism and modes of state repression, he prophesied. We have to get ready for the next phase of the struggle, and we old immigrants must find new ways to build solidarity with the new immigrants, he demanded. I remember those words many years later when I went to talk to him about creating the Migrants' Rights Network. As always, his testing and probing forced us to rethink and refine our analysis of what it was we wanted that organization to do. And MRN is a small part of Siva's legacy because it is built unashamedly on his analysis of the nexus of immigration control and institutionalized racism that foresaw the hostile environment. In conclusion, I just want to come back to that little job that he left me with at the end of our first meeting. Siva introduced me to ARHAG, the African Refugee Housing Action Group, because he wanted me to help them get their first two properties. I was working with a local authority at the time, and he said, "Oh, you can help here. You can do something real." Today, in accordance with Siva's demand for self-help and self-organization and solidarity, that little organization, we now provide over 900 homes for migrants and refugees from across the world. And in December, we will open a new community hub financed through our own organization, a 1.6 million development that will provide home to a range of community organizations from refugee and migrant self-help groups, and will also provide a range of services to the migrants and refugee communities we aim to serve. So in conclusion, Jenny and all of you at the Institute, we hope you will join us in honouring Siva at the launch of that new community hub in the beginning of next year. And we also hope you will work with us so that we can name one of our new housing developments in honour of Siva. We want to make, along with the Sivanandan Institute for Race Relations, another solid memorial for Siva that will never melt into the air. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Next, someone who's known us at the Institute and worked with Siva long before he got exalted titles. Herman Ousley. I won't call him Lord Ousley. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. He's a wind-up merchant. Sisters and brothers, you're not going to hear a long speech. You'll be very grateful for that. You've heard some very tasty tributes to the great man. It was my great pleasure to meet Siva, and like everyone else, when I first met him, I was trembling too, and equally happy to get out of the room in the same condition that Wayne did. But I was very pleased to be with someone, as I always felt when you knew when you were in a room with someone who really, truly represented greatness, because you could feel it inside of you. And what I've always managed to do around people like Siva and people like you in this room is to enable myself to be nourished by the quality that you bring, by what you do, and the presence that you have inspires without having to do much. And what admired me most about my meetings with Siva was how he listened. My contribution is about what I got out of Siva that helped me to do what I've done. And at the time when I first met him, you saw in a clip earlier his castigation of what was called race awareness training. And it was at a time when I was trying to get local government, as indeed other people, to start to recognize its failures to its local communities and connect with communities that were disadvantaged, communities that were excluded, people on the streets who were in the struggle, whether homeless, unemployed, or harangued left, right, and center by the police. And that was it was that time that Siva was able to listen to what we were trying to do, even though he didn't agree with it, and then point you very carefully and clearly in a direction which you went away and thought about how you made those connections, how you opened doors to allow people who had no voice to be able to express themselves, how you would have to find ways of getting politicians who wanted to keep power for themselves, even though they talked about devolution, they talked about community empowerment, all the nice warm words that meant nothing, because nothing really changed. And it was that comfort zone that eventually I managed to achieve of being around colleagues in the Institute of Race Relations, to make my contribution, very minor contribution, to the work of the Institute, but also taking so much away through Siva's leadership, through his colleagues, through the people he surrounded with, through the people he talked about that left you in awe, and took that away to put into your own work, in keeping your feet on the ground. In spite of whatever, as Colin alluded to, people may try to elevate you, you still have to recognize you're working with those who are disaffected, those who are excluded, those who are powerless, those who are voiceless, because that is the only way you can make progress, even if it's inching along. For me, as I conclude, what I take away in my life from my connection with Siva and the Institute of Race Relations, and what I have sought to pass on to others that I come into contact with, is that feeling that however much he was there up there as someone you worshipped, someone you admired, someone who inspired you, someone who moved you by all the things that people say he has done, is he never once made me feel I was inferior. I might have thought so by my reverence to him, but he never once made me feel anything other than I was special. I was special. And that's how he made a lot of people feel, that they were special, whoever they are, whatever their background. And the capacity to be so on a pedestal as we saw him, and as many people would have seen him, in what he did, what he represented, what he said, how he articulated. Nevertheless, he was able to come right down to where you were and where you thought you were, and help to bring you to a level in which you felt you were having an equal conversation, an equal communicate with him. He was a critic at the same time, but he was supportive. And for me, the one and the most important thing in making people feel special is the love that he brought. And I want to say thank you, Siva, for that love. It will go on throughout my whole life. It remains inspirational. And thank you for all the love you gave to everyone. It will never, ever be forgotten. Thank you.
Bali, I'm hogging the mic in this chairing session. It's okay. I will call you up. You've been hearing so far from people who knew Siva on the long haul from way back. We thought in this first session we should chance some voices from people who've come into to and around the Institute very recently. In fact, in the time that Sivanandan has been meeting people at home rather than in the office. And we have 3 young people whose work we particularly, younger people, whose work we particularly value at the Institute. And the first is Anya Edmund-Petit, please.
Hi. So I'm of the generation that became political with the invasion of Iraq the second time round. It was then that I realized that not everyone agreed with me, that I didn't have a universal opinion. And it was also the first time that I walked out of school and I started marching. So I suppose that was my political awakening. And that political engagement was then focused to an anti-racist lens at university when I began to explore what it meant to be British to me and to others and more generally. Before I came to the IRR, I knew there were campaigns. I'd been involved in them, some of them for years, and I knew that there were issues also in my peripheral vision. It wasn't until I started working that I would realize how many more there were and how many that I just hadn't seen at all. And working here, I've developed a much broader understanding of the societal injustices and the way institutionalized racism continues to permeate society. And I've also had the chance to explore avenues that were not open before and really look at the common thread between issues. And I think that's something that the Institute is fantastic at doing. And as part of that, there is that real sense of history that you just can't escape when you walk into the Institute. And part of that is very much linked to SIVA. It's a little daunting when you turn up and people have been there for, well, what did you say? 45 years ago you met Colin and SIVA, and I've been there 15 months, so I feel slightly daunted by all that. But, but working with people that have been there so long and, seeing their track record, it is really inspiring as well, because it does show that changes can be made, causes can be won, and, things can move on. And going forward, I think that that connection between history and the current is so very important. And, we need to learn from the past and respect what people have done, but also acknowledge that the world is different now, and so we need to use different tactics, and we need to, keep up with everything. And this is why I think the Black History Collection that is at the Institute is so invaluable, because it documents all the interventions across campaigns and shows the common thread of racism in newspaper cuttings and campaign materials from the Black community and grassroots groups from the 1950s to the 1980s. And so it's a way to see what has happened and a way to build on it for the struggles of now. And that is one of the major legacies of SIVA the librarian, who initiated that collection, and its ethos is continued in the IRR's work today. To be able to look at the refugee crisis, deaths in custody, the rise of the far right across Europe, and not only make interventions, but be able to see those common threads that link them all together and how we can then overcome them, is one of the greatest strengths I think that the Institute has. And that's my piece.
You're getting it, aren't you? He wasn't just somebody who got on platforms and showed off himself and made speeches. He was hell-bent on looking after what people will come to call a legacy. The Institute, what's accumulated at the Institute, the people that the Institute continues to attract. Just two more people in this first session. The first is Sophia Siddiqui.
When I was working in East Jerusalem in Palestine in 2016, I came across the special issue of Race and Class on Kashmir, which is the journal that was founded by SIVA. I wanted to connect settler colonialism in Palestine to other occupations in the world that I didn't know much about, and I felt a responsibility to learn more about Kashmir, in particular due to my family history. I immediately loved Race and Class, as it's not just academic, but it's always connected to the material impact of racism from the perspective of the most vulnerable. It's this commitment to fighting injustice that I try to keep at the heart of what I write and what I do. I was lucky enough to get a job here as an editorial assistant for Race and Class last October. Working here has been an absolute whirlwind, and I feel myself growing every day. Learning about the history of anti-racism from people who've been at the heart of the struggle for over 20 years has humbled me. Struggles that I've come across for the first time, such as end deportations, campaigns against Prevent, and Islamophobia, are fights that the IRR have been working against for 20 to 40 years. Learning from people who have a commitment, in SIVA's words, to the racism that kills, not just the racism that discriminates, is invaluable, whether through meticulously collating every death in detention, every death in custody, and keeping a record of every racial attack. It's this dedication that I admire the most about my colleagues at the IRR, and these are the real superheroes of our world. I really believe that only by building on the anti-racist work that has come before us and learning from the successes and the mistakes of the past can we move forward in the present. I'm hoping to share what I learn in the office with my friends, family, and other people I work with in grassroots campaigns and through my writing. For me, my interest in anti-racism comes from my commitment to feminism. The lack of an anti-racist perspective has meant that I often feel conflicted with a lot of mainstream feminism, and this is what I want to contribute to Siva's legacy going on. I'm writing on this topic, and also I'll be hosting discussion sessions at the IRR that start a conversation on gender-based violence, so we can discuss how to challenge sexual abuse without a carceral approach and without fear of racist repercussions. Thank you.
I'm being so moved. Names not being mentioned, Sophia just referred to a bunch of people. Jenny Bourne, you'll see her later up here. Liz Fekete, you'll see her later up here. Hazel Waters, sitting in the front row over there. These are people that I've known from way back, all the way through my time at the Institute. They've been part of the delivery of Sivanandan, part and parcel of all the stuff that we see that we think maybe is just him. Actually, all of this is fed into that. And I'm really touched by the people we've recruited who are coming through now. Thank you very much. You too. The last person that on this session that I'm going to call up is somebody who's really just on the edge, even more on the edge than the last two you just saw of the Institute's work. He's come to us as a volunteer. We've had many volunteers. They come, they grow through us and so on. Recently, I'm sorry, Priya, I'm going to sound like I'm disloyal to you. I found myself saying about this person who's coming on, I said, you know, I think Daniel's my best student ever. I work with him a great deal most recently on around Grenfell, Justice for Grenfell, and campaigns we're trying to support and move there. His name is Daniel Rennick. Thanks, Daniel.
Colin warned me about being good with time, and I don't actually have any notes prepared, so what you see there is my timer. When Jenny told me that I would be speaking, one of the things I would always kind of use Siva to pivot on is the engagement with Stuart Hall around the new times. And though I kind of think that would be a good way to spend my time, because I think as a child of neoliberalism, that debate framed everything. And if people had paid more attention to what Siva was saying there, I don't feel that we would have had as many conflicts growing up as I have had. But actually, for me, Siva is more of an existentialist than anything else. There's something about reading him that hits you in the solar plexus. And it's that politics of the solar plexus that he talks about. He says you feel it viscerally, right? And I think that is that articulation and that feeling, that lived theory that runs through his work, where you bridge academia and the front line, is the real area that I think he stands as an exemplar. He is one of the greatest writers that I've ever read. But more than anything else, he articulates some things that both go with lived experience and touch upon the deep academic issues of the moment. And I've never really been able to find anyone that parallels him. And I find that he's almost prophetic with everything that he wrote. I throw refugees at globalism around the radical left at this moment in time who want to play to nativism. If you read that and the decimation of the fatuous distinction between economic migrant and an asylum seeker, I think that is one of the great areas that Siva contributes to the modern struggle. But actually, it's just that there is no limit. You can, with 3 minutes, I have no ability to do justice to the man. I actually never met him, which was a regret of mine, and I came across him and the significance of his work too late in his life for me to really pay him the respects that I think he deserves. I'm quite shocked that my generation don't know Siva. As such, I have kind of set about to kind of try and popularize his works. But there isn't much of him on tape. There's transcripts, there's tapes, there's a way in which that I hope I'm going to be working with the Institute to try and popularize his works going forward. But he really isn't somebody who easily translates into this generation. He's somebody who you have to have had some level of engagement with. And I think that genuinely the people who find that engagement easiest are the people who are frontline. There's people who don't just keep their work to the ivory towers or talk for the sake of talking. It's the fundamental question he always seemed to ask with the work he did was, how is this going to serve the people at the coalface of the struggle? And it's that I think is the greatest contribution he makes to me, because as I go forward, I'm always trying to think, well, how does this translate into what it's like for the people actually living it, right? That's what lived theory is to me. It's very easy to take on a position and to say how great these positions are, or to write something, or a Facebook status, there you go, sorry. Right?
Nice cue.
But actually, the real alchemy, the real thing is to take something that is so visceral and so real and so raw to certain people and to translate it into a language of struggle. And Siva's unparalleled in that respect, and I'm honored to have spoken here. Thank you very much.
We're getting to the end of this session. Bali, is there anything that you want to say to conclude? Okay. Before the session actually ends, we have one more contribution from the platform. I think we might as well stay here. Linton? Linton Kwesi-Johnson.
Good afternoon. Hello, Hazel and Jenny. I first met Siva back in 1973. I was a student at Goldsmiths, and it's rather complicated how I got to meet Siva. I think, if my memory serves me well, an American friend, a white American friend of mine, named Bob Stewart, was writing a PhD thesis on slavery and religion. And I think he used to be a Jesuit priest at one time, but he'd found a woman in Jamaica and had forgotten all about the priesthood. And he said, I know a journal where you can get your poems published. He said, there's a man called, if I remember rightly, Alexander Kirby, Alex Kirby, who was then the editor of the journal Race Today, which was a part of the Institute of Race Relations. So I brought my poems to Alexander Kirby. But of course, nothing went into Race Today, the old Race Today, without the approval of Siva. And he subjected me to some interrogations about my poetry. And I showed him stuff I'd written in English and in Jamaican. And he said, forget about the English stuff. You know, I don't like this moon and June rhyming thing. Do your Jamaican stuff. Anyway, my first poem was published in 1973 in Race Today. That was a poem called 5 Nights of Bleeding. A little bit later, Race Today came under the editorship of Darcus Howe. And Darcus Howe hijacked Race Today with all the staff, moved out, went to Brixton, and formed a collective, the Race Today Collective, of which I became a member, with the collusion of the then chairman of the Institute of Race Relations, John LaRose, Siva's old comrade. I don't know how that played out between John and Siva, but I know that when John died, there was a very fine tribute to him from the Institute of Race Relations. Also, in the journal, I had my first essay published in the journal Race and Class. It was an essay teasing out a sociology of reggae music, and I called it Jamaican Rebel Music. And Siva kindly published that in Race and Class. That was in 1976 or 1977, thereabouts. Anyway, my job here is not to reminisce, but to recite some poems. I'm going to do 2 poems, and I wanted to make that connection between John LaRose and Sivanandan. John LaRose, incidentally, was the founder of the first black publishing house and bookseller in this country, New Beacon Books, founder of the, joint founder of the Caribbean Artist Movement, director of the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, etc., etc., etc. I'm going to read 2 poems, one by John LaRose and one by myself. And the poem by John LaRose is from his collection, Islets of Truth Within Me. And this poem is called Unending Journey. I no longer join in boisterous outbursts of the young. My laughter inhabits areas saddened with experience and disaster. Clattering noise and grief clamps my tongue to a lower key. I live on the sharp edge of hope, on the testing road of an unending journey through Golgotha and Gethsemane to paradise islands of history. God's eyes did not find us cut off by thick curtains of clouds. We did not see the yellow twinkle of the stars that came out to comfort the intricate ironwork of our bodies. Nothing for our vision but ourselves. The fire burn of our insides rule the boiling passion of our dreams. Through mirages of heat haze, I see indistinct roads in retrospect. Nowhere was safe but our prudence. My mothering compass helped while I walked or rode the cloudy ridges of the sky. There was no certain road to Eden. No seer, shaman, or prophet can rope us all together in the same boat as in the flood. Each tightly woven string of hope strengthens the rope with its own steel, its own fiber and foible, its own latent story and metal of our need. Hedgerows here are different. No flapping birds. Stone upon stony silence, mask, broken back and bone. Hard to fathom this eerie beauty now. But journeys begin and end with another journey on the rivers of a time. And my own poem, and I suspect, just suspect, that Siva might have liked this poem. It's called The Great Insurrection. It was in April 1981, down in the ghetto of Brixton, that the Babylon them caused such a friction that it bring about a great insurrection. And it spread all over the nation. It was truly an historical occasion. It was event of the year, and I wish I had been there when we run riot all over Brixton, when we mash up plenty police van, when we mash up the Wicked One plan, when we mash up the Swamp 81. For what? To make the ruler them understand that we not take no more of them oppression. And when me check out the ghetto grapevine, to find out all I could have find, every rebel just a revel in them story. Them a talk about the power and the glory. Them a talk about the burning and the looting. Them a talk about the smashing and the grabbing. Them a tell me about the vanquish and the victory. Them said the Babylon them went too far. So what? We had was for burn 2 car. And 1 and 2 innocent get mar. But what? Now so it got some time in a war in Star. Now so it got some time in a war. Them say we burn down the judge, we could have burned the landlord. We burn down the judge, we never burn the landlord. When we run riot all over Brixton, when we mash up plenty police van, when we mash up the Wicked One plan, when we mash up the Swamp 81. Them say we commandeer car and we gather ammunition. We build a barricade and the wicked catch afraid. We send out, we scout, figure find them whereabout, then we farm up with posse and we make we raid. Well, now them run gang go plan counter action. But the plastic bullet and the water cannon will bring a blam blam, will bring a blam blam. Never mind scar, man. Will bring a blam blam.
Thank you, Linton. And thanks for the memories. I think we'd better get off very fast because we've stretched ourselves into the time of the next session. Thank you to everybody. You know how grateful I am. Thank you.
Hello everybody. I'm sorry, we're going to move straight into the second session. You know, Wayne and Herman both said about trembling when they first went to meet Siva. And I have to admit that I'm really, really, really trembling at this moment. And the reason that I'm trembling is because I have to introduce myself as Liz Fekete, the Director of the Institute of Race Relations. And at a time where I'm feeling Siva's presence in the room, it's very, very difficult for me to think of myself as any other than the very, very ignorant young woman who walked into the Institute when I was the same age as Sophia and Anya, very ignorant but wanting to learn, and then meeting the finest teacher that ever was. So this session is Siva the Alchemist. And before bringing the guys onto the stage, because there are a lot of guys on this platform, I wanted a little bit of gold time on my own up here. So I wanted to explain to you what we meant when we say Siva the Alchemist. An alchemist is someone who transforms or creates something through a seemingly magical process. But the true alchemists do not change base metal into gold. They give us words and images as weapons to transform the world. And that's what Siva did, and that's what we're looking at here in this session, which is dedicated to the revolutionary content of Siva's language and the vitality of his words. So this platform, we have poets, playwrights, and activists inspired by the magic of his words, and particularly his novel, When Memory Dies. I wanted to just say a few words about the special alchemy Siva brought to the workplace, and I wanted to give you a bit of an idea of what a typical day at the office was like with Sivanandan. If there's any funders in the office, or if they're watching on the live stream, could you please put your earplugs in? I think it's fair to say that under Siva, we weren't spending a typical day writing progress reports, strategic reviews, measuring outcomes, or discussing our particular brand of racial justice within our communication strategy. As Mussarat said, for Siva, if you couldn't play, you couldn't be human. And if you were always taking yourself seriously, you couldn't do a day's hard work. So you'd be working very hard, and he'd drop everything to read you a poem. Dylan Thomas, Keats, Tagore, Omar Khayyam. And, you know, Siva always used to say that in a capitalist, racist society, the dividing line between criminality and political activism could be razor thin. And that's why I think he was particularly fond of criminally inclined cats, like McCavity the cat and Growl Tiger's Last Stand. Of course we worked hard. He was exacting. He was ferocious. He didn't like mistakes. He used to say that just because we're on the left, it doesn't mean that you don't know where your apostrophe goes. You had to write better than the right because you were on the left. And Jesus Christ, when I think about it, I couldn't even spell, let alone know where my apostrophes goes. But more than that, somebody he was very fond of quoting was Amilcar Cabral, the great African revolutionary theorist in the fight against Portuguese colonialism. Because if you're going to transform society, you need a militant political culture. And as Cabral, he used to teach us, said that a political culture has to be the combusting force for revolutionary change. A vocabulary that is polite, neutered, safe, dare I say it, middle class and colourless, cannot produce change. Language is communication. And Siva taught us that while we need to communicate with words that express love and gentleness, we also have to use words that assault, that are angry, that are full of rage. I think for Siva, there were no safe spaces. There were no perfect places. There was only the ever-ending struggle each day to make the world a better place. I think it has to be said, for those of you coming to Siva's earlier writings for the first time, the period was a very male period. Words have to be muscular, words have to be tender. But I do believe that the female community around the IRA, and particularly his wife Jenny Bourne, we worked our womanly alchemy on Sivanandan, and we will continue to do that as we take Siva into the future. And I'm incredibly proud of the fact that actually the staff is actually an all-woman staff at the moment. So that is part of Siva's legacy. Before we hear from our panel, Colin Prescod is going to read from Siva's prize-winning novel, When Memory Dies. Most of you come to Siva as a militant black activist, as an anti-imperialist, as an organic intellectual. But in his heart of hearts, the person that he felt he truly was an exile. And he wrote this novel to fill the void in me where my country used to be. Thank you.
This is just the first page of Siva's novel. It's how he begins to announce the intention of the novel. Mike, do you need to speak into it more? Sorry about that. Okay. The first page, how it opens. My memory begins, as always, with the rain, crouched as a small boy against the great wall of the old colonial building that once housed the post office. It frightened me, the great monsoon downpour, and saddened me too, threw me back on my little boy self and its lonelinesses, the growing things in myself I could not tell others about, the first feel of the sadness of a world that kept Sanji from school because he had no shoes. And I welcomed the lightning then, not frightened anymore, for it would strike me dead, and Sanji would have my shoes, and I would be sad no more. Oh, I was sad for the trees, and the birds, and the little kid goat battered and cowed by the rain. I was afraid for the plantain trees, heavy with fruit, now swaying dangerously from their trunks. And I was sorry that the crows, proud kings of the dung heap, should make common cause with house sparrows under the eaves of roofs. But suddenly, the rain would lift, and the trees come erect again, putting forth to the sun, which had as suddenly appeared. And the crows would caw once more, and a mist would rise from the hot roads like dawn. It was the season's return in that moment that had gone and come again. It was awe and grief and wonderment crowding in on each other, a first involuntary affirmation of life that was somehow mixed up with Sanji's shoes. It was the first memory of my growing world. Other seasons I would come to know, spring and autumn and winter, and other countries where shoes abounded. But the things that crowded in on me that day in the rain, and in many rains after, and made me an exile for the better part of my life, were also the things that connected me to my country and made me want to tell its story. But there is no story to tell, no one story anyway. Not since that day in 1505, when Fidalgo Don Lorenzo de Almeida, resplendent in gold braid and epaulettes and hat plumed with all the birds of paradise, landed on our shores and broke us from our history. No one story with a beginning and an end. No story that picks up from where the past left off. Only bits and shards of stories. And those are the people I knew, and that only in passing, my own parents and son, or heard tell of, for there was no staying in a place or in a time to gather a story whole. Only an imagined time and place. And no story of the country, or if of the country, not our story, but theirs, the Paranjis. Except that we all bore the imprint of that history, like a stigma, internalized it even, made it our own, against our will, calling to memory the while to lose it by losing memory itself. Opening. Thank you.
We're going straight to the next film clip.
They don't talk about the emotional disturbance, the trauma of ethnic wars, of civil wars. You are one people 1 minute, and the next minute you are fragmented, broken up, torn apart. And I saw people burnt alive on the streets. You know, one person poured paraffin, another person lit her, and all because he was a Tamil. A nephew of mine was burned to death. Friends of mine were killed. I tried to rescue people from various houses, and I was terrified. I pissed in my trousers. But all that makes you feel that it's time to take stock. It was time to sit down and look at your own life. So I left and came to Britain in 1958. Sri Lanka is the most beautiful country in the world, I saw, for all refugees say that of their country. Terrible. It's a complete uprooting. And you've got to start life all over again. And I started life fairly late, all over again at 35, as a tea boy in a library at Kingsbury, because I couldn't get a job in a bank. There was so much racism, plangent, undifferentiated, unspoken racism. You can hate a system. You can't hate people because of their color, or their race, or their religion. That is beyond my reckoning of what a human being is.
David, Chris, Viru, John, would you like to come up into this lovely cosy space? Thank you. So we're first going to hear, just let everyone settle down. We're going to hear from one of Siva's new young friends, Viru Shilanga Raja, who's going to speak about the impact of When Memory Dies, Siva's novel, on a new generation of young Tamils. Thank you, Viru.
Thank you, Liz. I want to start off by apologising, because most of this speech was prepared last night in the pub. Setting the bar low, I know. There have been known race riots in Sri Lanka since independence, wrote A. Sivanandan in 1984. What there has been is a series of increasingly virulent pogroms against the Tamil people by the Sinhala state, resulting in the degeneracy of Sinhala society and its rapid descent into barbarism. And all this has been achieved in the name of Sinhala civilization and Buddhist enlightenment within a matter of 35 years by the concerted efforts of politicians, priests, and private armies. When the British left Ceylon in 1948, the lines of communal conflict had already been drawn. 150 years of British rule had brought together 3 different social formations under one central administration for purposes of economic exploitation, but for purposes of political control, the colonial government had reinforced the communal divisions that ran like a seam around those social formations. It divided in order to rule what it integrated in order to exploit. I'll repeat, it divided in order to rule what it integrated in order to exploit. I think those 2 paragraphs are a perfect illustration of Sivanandan's ability to capture the reader with his poetry and his language and to make history alive as he does in his novel. I always maintain that people, I think probably most of the people in this room, but most people I certainly meet who are aware of his work on anti-racism and so forth, they're not so kind of familiar with his background in Sri Lanka, the first 35 years of his life. And for me, I think you cannot comprehend the man, either personally or even politically or intellectually, without reading this novel and understanding the history of the island that formed him. He often retells that story of, in 1958, how the dramatic escape, there were pogroms against Tamil people at the time, and he dressed as a police officer to escape a baying mob, and he went out had a double baptism of fire, where he left Sri Lanka and went straight into the Notting Hill riots. And it was those 2 events that had a major impact on his life. And I think for me personally, as a young Tamil, second generation, growing up in this country, he had a massive intellectual impact on me, particularly after 2009, when the genocide took place, where the Sri Lankan state annihilated, we don't even know how many people, some say 40 to 70,000, some reports say 147,000. But it was those events following that year which had a major impact on me and a lot of my colleagues and friends. So in the years that followed, when having to, us having been disrupted or broken apart by our history and having to educate ourselves and learn about our heritage and the culture that we missed out on, coming across the works of Sivanandan it was unbelievable. I remember reading his essays for the first time. We're all familiar with them, From Resistance to Rebellion, the one about attacking New Times. It was like a hammer to my head. It was incredible. What I just read out earlier was from a 1984 essay that he wrote about the island. And still to this day, I would recommend to anyone, as a sort of primer, that is probably the best short introduction you're ever going to read about the history of the island, or the recent history of the island, I should say. In terms of the novel, if you're familiar with his essays and you read the novel, you'll find all his sort of aphorisms, like the ones behind me here. You'll find a lot of his quotes and a lot of his politics really comes through. We are here because you were there, and his critiques of parliamentarism and tactics, his scathing indictment of the Sinhalese left who betrayed the Tamil working class, and indeed their own, and went down the road of racism and communalism. It's a book that's romantic without being idealistic, historical without being overly deterministic, creative yet authentic, full of clarity yet also contradictions. It's about revolution and radicalism, justice and love, and resistance and rebellion. It's a book that, it's hard to summarize, but it portrays the island over 3 generations, from the British colonial periods, then it moves on to independence, when, for lack of a better term, shit hit the fan, and then finally ends with the beginning of the militant movements and into full-out ethnic war. And he was always very sad when I'd speak with him about the Tamil people and the island in general. And he was very despondent, and he was towards near the end of his life, and he always felt very powerless that he couldn't do anything. But that book, he told me, which took him about 2 decades to write, it really was a lifetime endeavor. And he also told me that was his gift to his people and his gift to his country. I'm going to end with his words, just as I began, but 2009 was a very traumatic time for Tamil people, as it was for Sivanandan, or Siva Mama, as I would refer to him, or Siva Uncle, if you will. And he wrote a letter to The Guardian around February 2009, right in the middle of the genocide. And it's one of the most captivating and emotional bits of writing I've ever come across that he wrote. There will be neither victory nor peace in Sri Lanka till the rights of the Tamil people are enshrined in a federal constitution that devolves power to the Tamil areas in the north and east, as was envisaged by the Norwegian peace process of 2002 to 2005. First, because the cause for which the LTT has fought, if not its methods, is the cause of Tamil peoples everywhere and cannot be suppressed. Second, because the present government, even more than all the governments before it, has, through the Aryanization of race, the perversion of Buddhism into a violent communal creed, and the exaltation of the singular language as the language of office, achieved a successful symbiosis of the fascist elements that keeps it in power. In the process, it has killed off civil society with its blanket censorship, judicious murders, and suppression of the intelligentsia, till there is no one left to oppose it. Instead, it has bred a culture of hate among the singular masses that sees babies kitted out in army fatigues, accepts torture as a fact of war, and calls for the complete subjugation, if not the ethnic cleansing, of the Tamil people, which in turn ensures the perpetuation of an authoritarian government. Alas, my country.
Siva wasn't the only teacher and poet connected to the Institute of Race Relations. We are very, very lucky to have David Edgar, one of our finest anti-fascist playwrights, and Chris Searle. I mean, you can't really put Chris Searle in a box. Chris Searle is just everything, on our management committee. And as some of Siva's oldest friends, I'd like to call on David first and then Chris to say a few words.
I first met Siva through literature, dramatic literature. In the early 70s, I was writing a play about the National Front, and I wanted to use the Institute's library to research it. As my work progressed, I realized that I also wanted to write an article about re-emergent British fascism. I think I'd thought that writing political polemic would be easier than doing the art. There could not be a better place, and indeed person, to disabuse me of that delusion than the officers of Race and Class and its editor and often lead contributor. As Colin reminded us in his beautiful reading, Siva became a literary writer through his novel and short stories, but his political essays rang with literary influence and sang with literary style. In the interview in the latest Race and Class, Siva speaks of the great political and indeed Marxist writings he discovered at the University of Ceylon. But like most writers, he was inspired by an English teacher, Lynn Ludovich. In that interview, Siva quotes Dylan Thomas and cites Chaucer's Wife of Bath. His essay on the liberation of the black intellectual quotes César, Valéry, Sartre, Shakespeare, Carlyle, and Blake, with R.D. Laing, Jean Genet, and Angela Davis thrown in for good measure. In his robust critique of Marxism Today's New Times thesis, he drew on the support of T.S. Eliot, though not, as I remember, drawn from Old Possum's book of Practical Cats. But on top of the reference, there was the influence. Reference, influence, a sub-Sivaism of itself. Of course, we're celebrating the content of his polemical writing, his magisterial analysis of the black struggle in the 70s, his brave attack on cultural politics in the 80s, the extraordinary prescience of his writings on globalized capitalism. Siva's arguments have entered the political bloodstream because they're right. They're convincing because their analysis was always backed up by such extensive factual support. Can there be a more detailed, comprehensive, and effective primer on immigration and race relations legislation than race, class, and the state? But their echo was amplified by the brilliance of the phrase-making, the ringing image we wear our passports on our faces, the vivid alliteration from resistance to rebellion, the savvy cultural wit, poverty is the new black, sometimes a recognizable process simply but devastatingly described, what Powell says today, the Tories say tomorrow, and Labour legislates the day after. Often the most original and complex perceptions rendered pellucidly clear, as in his description of the economics of the Silicon Age. The skills have been taken into the machines, leaving it to the unskilled to operate them and the highly skilled to program them. In the title of his second Silicon article, the delicious metonym of the new circuits of imperialism. The pun wielded as a cutting blade, post-Scarman, as he put it, equal opportunity morphing into equal opportunism. Community policemen playing fairy godmother and godfather at once. And of course, the antithesis, a wonderful example quoted by Veru, often with more than a whiff of Shavian and Brechtian paradox. Issues of class fought out on a terrain of race. Thinking to do, not thinking to think. The violence of the violated. And of course, who you are is what you do. And most memorably of all, we're here because you were there. It's no surprise that Siva was attracted to ideas first coined by others that were expressed with his own attack and economy, institutional racism, the market state. But it's also no surprise that he continued to read literature as well as write it throughout his life, including, as he grew older, more of the poetry of the English 19th century. As a thinker, Siva was scornful of those who abandoned economics for culture, but expressed in a succession of wonderfully rolling phrases. His vision of socialism was not just of an economic project coming after capitalism, but as an ideology of human worth whose time has come. A moral creed, a secular faith, tolerant, loving, creative, increasing all to increase the one. I came to the right place.
Yeah, good afternoon, brothers and sisters. The first time I met Siva was in 1973, I think at the Institute's old Jermyn Street Centre. He was warm, he was friendly, full of jokes, as he invariably was. He was teasing me about getting the sack from my East London school for publishing my students' poems in Stepney Words a couple of years before. It was clear he loved poetry. Then suddenly, he quoted T.S. Eliot at me. Some lines, I think, from the Four Quartets. I remember being surprised and exclaiming, "Hang on, Siva, Eliot, he was an arch reactionary, a bloody Tory." And he answered, "Ah, but the language, the words, listen to them." The next time I saw him, it was a few years later at the old premises in Pentonville Road. And he quoted Keats at me from his 1817 letter to Benjamin Bailey. You remember? "I am certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth." Ever since then, when I've read Siva, I've been kidnapped by his use of the English language. How he harnessed this, the most formidable and powerful of English imperial institutions, and turned its base oppressive linguistic metal into golden, figurative, revolutionary insights, using his huge imaginative reach. He was a poet of ideas. He used metaphor to forge his ideas. And it was all in a second language. Take his titles, for they all emanate from that Keatsian imagination and the metaphors it created. From poetical truth grounded in the real world. His longing for ideas of freedom for the world's struggling peoples was a hunger, but a different hunger. How we must use the insights of the past to inform the present and forge the future was the startling image, catching history on the wing. How those who fight back cooperatively and generously in the hearts of our cities too are bonded as communities of resistance. How we must never forget both our mistakes and successes, but always learn from them. For when memory dies, so does our ability to criticize, self-criticize, and create a new life together. And how this urge to change is not only in our brains, but in our heart's blood. For the heart is where the battle is. And how new forms of imperial power stemming from the new technology can also be grasped and welded in our own struggles. Those very circuits of imperialism can give us a current and a currency to also help set us free. Siva lived to see institutions and forms of the imperialism he had known on his pulses and lived and struggled within, transformed by those it sought to suppress and dehumanize. More than anyone I have read in my life, and alongside Fanon and James, Siva showed us how the language of imperialism, if we can grasp it, transform it, and liberate it, can help to set us free, create new metaphors of socialism, and help our children find freedom too in the reality of their world and their own real lives. So long live his memory, his struggle, his humanity, his language, for they all belong to us. All of us.
Thank you, Chris. John Pandit is going to take us out and I think fittingly talk to us about the music in Siva.
Thanks, Liz. Hiya, sisters and brothers. I haven't got anything prepared, but I'll start off with something I said at a previous Institute Race Relations meeting, and it's we're all talking about our identities and histories. Well, I'm from that generation there, and I was radicalised by a hate preacher. For a lot of you will remember Margaret Thatcher. And it set us off on a journey. When we responded first from the heart, a moral objection to what was going on. And as that, we came in through various organisations, through the networks. And for me, started off in Islington here, Islington Anti-Fascist Action, and the work of Searchlight. And in Searchlight, we'd read Campaign Against Racism and Fascism. And that was my introduction to the work of the Institute and the work of Siva. And all the other organisations and networks that we were part of and how we struggled over the years. And at first, it's from the heart, it's instinctive, you do this. But then you need the theory, you need the perspective, you need knowledge and understanding deeper to keep you going. Otherwise, you just fall apart or you burn out or you start grasping at things and you think, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And all that air leads you on a wild goose chase. So I was very lucky, very privileged to be amongst all the organisations and groups and campaigns and myriad struggles that have gone on in the past few decades. And I was very fortunate out of that about 25 years ago, in fact 25 years ago exactly this summer, to do a little workshop at a place called Community Music and establish a band with friends called the Asian Dub Foundation. And from that, we started to work, and we started, one of the first few tunes we did was called Debris, and this was a critique of colonialism inspired by Siva. We are here because you were there. And it followed on from that, and in 2000, we had a track, and I'd always admired Siva's, all of us all admired Siva's, not just when he spoke, but the cadence, the musicality of how he spoke, and the content, and how that could be wonderful within spoken word, within music, just like we've just had LKJ on just now. And this, I decided we got to do this. So I had a track. I just went down the institute. I said, Siva, could I record you? And he went into a back office. I had a little microphone. And he said, okay, let's do it. So 2 takes, which if you're an engineer or a musician, to have someone just do it in 2 takes is great. Any vocalist is wonderful. So we recorded him a track called Colour Line, which was on an album in those days. And in fact, during the recording, it was only 2 takes, I'm done. And he says, you know what, like any self-respecting rapper, I can sing too. And proceeds to do a few bars of a Tamil melody. And it's in the recording. I take it away. I get down the studio and I have to go off. I give it to my colleague Chandra Soni, and he phones me up about 15 minutes later. He says, it's already on the track. I put the whole thing on and it's perfect. Not only that, whatever he was singing, it's in tune with a track that he'd not even heard. So that was wonderful. And this track, we took it all over the place. It became such a firm favourite. We went all over Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, as far as Brazil to Japan, and we'd play that track with Siva on it. And a lot of people came back afterwards and said, oh yeah, and they said, yeah, that's where we heard SIVA, so that did its job. And that's the thing about the different forms of arts, novels, how it can get into people's soul and how people then respond to it. So 10 years ago, I always wanted to reprise this. So I wrote a track and I went up to see SIVA again and we recorded a track. And unfortunately, just through life and illness in my family, I never actually did anything. And it's been sitting in the archive. So here today, with visuals from my good friends from the Rainbow Collective, we're going to present to you a new track called Passports on Our Faces. Thank you very much.
Globalization has engendered a monolithic economic system. September 11th has engendered a populist anti-Muslim culture. The war on Iraq has found posthumous justification in the politics of fear. Together, they spell the erosion of civil liberties and the ushering in of a new state racism that promises to safeguard the patriot nation from the shadow enemy within. White racial superiority is back on the agenda. In the guise this time, not of a super race, but of a super nation. A chosen people on a mission to liberate the world. It is their notion of a superior civilization that marks out the racism of the 21st century and embeds it in America's imperial project. But there are other racisms. Xeno-racism, which is not based on skin color, but on fear or hatred of strangers and the need to preserve our way of life. Racism directed at the Muslims. To produce a racism which cannot tell a settler from an immigrant from an asylum seeker, an asylum seeker from a Muslim from a terrorist. We all wear our passports on our faces. We all wear our passports on our faces. When rulers ask us, old colonials, new refugees, to live up to British values, it is the Enlightenment values that they have betrayed that they point to. But the Enlightenment project is not over until liberty, equality, and fraternity are extended to include the non-white peoples of the world. That is the challenge of our presence to Europe. Passports on our faces. We all wear our passports on our faces.
think we finished this section. Thank you very much.
I'm taking you now from that beautiful, sublime music to something very mundane. And I'm sorry, everyone, and I'm sorry, Siva, that it's fallen to me to take you to the question of money. This is just a note to say that at the end of this session, which is the end of the event, we will have people at the door with collecting boxes, because we are very pleased to make this a free event, but it has cost the Institute money that it didn't have. So all your cash, your checks, and all that gold that was made in the alchemy of the session before, please have that ready, and we'll be collecting it at the door. And those of you who already did send a tribute after Siva's death, obviously we're not asking you again. We thank you for everything that you've done. And now I'm going to change and put my hard hat on for the Siva the Builder session. And I just want to start by telling you, or sharing with you, what an irony it is to call Siva a builder, because he was the most impractical man that I've ever known. He was a man who had no idea about how the world fitted together. Sorry, Siva, you always called me your fiercest critic, and I have to have a bit of fun at your expense. And actually, Siva loved the piss being taken out of him on these issues as well. Siva was, and there is a Sinhalese word, I think it's in When Memory Dies, there is this word, godaya. Sorry, there's probably 2 people in the whole room who know what it means, but I think it means the sort of unsophisticated country bumpkin, the man who comes to town and doesn't really know how things work or can't really speak English properly, the sort of Jacques Tati figure who was in Mon Oncle and Traffic. And that was Siva, the man who wrote all about technology, who anticipated momentous changes in production and communication, but who merely made it into the 20th century, let alone the 21st. And he always said his village was one of the last in the country to get electricity. Is that so, Punny? And it showed. You'd get in a car with Siva. The children will remember this. We're already late for an appointment, but he knew a shortcut. And you knew then that you were lost for the rest of the evening. And those awful flannelette post-war sheets, when they wore out, Siva knew exactly how to fix them. Sellotape, of course. And showing off the new electric hedge cutter, he demonstrated to friends how to do a tennis shot. I think it was the backhand slice. And we were in A&E for hours. Changing a washer on the kitchen tap. Siva didn't need plumbers. He didn't need to know where the stopcock was. I found him with pliers, a rain hat, Mac, umbrella, the floor inundated. Sellotape, super glue. We later had to make that Evo stick, and after that, Pritt stick, and rubber bands. They were always Siva's stock in trade. But he absolutely loved DIY, or as he termed it grandly, intermediate technology. Siva was no builder in the conventional sense, but he was a great builder of ideas, of people, and of organizations, which is what we shall talk about here with those who've known him for over 40 years. And first of all, Gus will speak. Gus, whom we met in the early 1970s, when he faced a similar battle over the censorship by the Runnymede Trust, I think, of a report you'd done into the policing of black youth in Handsworth, and you were being censored, just as we were being censored in the Institute of Race Relations. And Gus will talk about that struggle to transform the institute with which he was connected. Then Nancy Murray, who's come all the way from the United States to be with us today, will talk about the transformation of the journal Race and Class. And I'm sorry, we have very little time this afternoon. And so each speaker's been put on a very tight rein. But there are copies available in the Brockway room of accounts that Siva wrote about the transforming of the Institute, and also a very good article that Nancy wrote about race and class. So please pick them up and take them with you. And then we're going to go to the activists who've come from across Europe, Bitplat from Berlin, Luke from Brussels, and Khalid from Oslo. And they will talk about Siva's impact. And finally, Suresh Grover. And I particularly want to thank Suresh for his support of Siva in these latter years, and also in his help in organising this event, despite all the many cases and campaigns he was handling. You'll pay for that. More money, please. Suresh will, at the end of the session, talk about how we can use the building blocks and blueprints that Siva has left for us. But first of all, Gus, please talk about the Institute.
My friends, we bring who and what we are, and we are what we bring to the world, to our relationships, to our interactions, and particularly to the interface between the displacement of the dualism of the personal and the political. Siva was the second type of builder that Jenny talked about. He provided us with tools for analysis, for understanding, and tools for action, thus helping us to frame ourselves and what we bring in our interactions with the world. As Jenny indicated, I got to know Siva really in 1970. I was working for the Runnymede Trust in Handsworth in Birmingham, doing some work on youth, the condition of being black and young in that city, and particularly as black young people experienced life in schools, on the streets, in youth clubs, and at the interface with the police and criminal justice system. The trustees of the Runnymede Trust, and most of you would know who they are, I won't name them now, were very concerned about the strident nature of the report. It did not pull its punches. And there were many, in the media particularly, who were criticizing it and asking about its empiricism. As a consequence of that, Deepak Nandi, the director of the Institute of the Runnymede Trust, got two academics, John Lambert, a criminologist at Birmingham University, and the late Bob Holman, who was also at Birmingham teaching social administration and social work, to write their own critiques, not of the report, but of what Birmingham City Council and others were doing at the time. And both those three, my main report, Bob Holman's and John Lambert's contributions, formed the text Race in the Inner City, which was published in 1970. Siva talked with me helpfully after I too had all my tremblings and so forth in the presence of the great man about all of that stuff. And that led to a series of other conversations. We've talked and mentioned, obviously, a lot today about race and class. What connected that journal, the writing that was going on in Race Today at the time, and what I was doing in Handsworth, was the way in which we as black people were being blamed for the condition in those urban inner city areas that everybody was experiencing. And Siva particularly was helpful in framing a different narrative about race and about our intersection in those working class areas in Britain's inner cities against a background and history of white working class struggle. It was a narrative that assisted white people in understanding themselves and their own history. It was a struggle that helped the nation to understand that while the left, and particularly the organized workers' movement, had always been about conditions of pay and conditions of work, etc., in the workplace, we had to organize within our communities around this used to do with housing, the education experience of our children, the police harassment of us on the streets, and all of those other matters. But then, particularly, the way in which our black people as workers experienced the trade union movement, the movement that was supposed to be representing their own interests. So the discussions that Siva had with black trade unionists, and I remember it well, was about how they could organize themselves as black workers to challenge the racism within the trade union movement itself. And of course, there are many here who will remember the interventions that we made in relation to the Imperial Typewriters strike, the Granwick struggles, and at another level, the Greenham Common protests. So I say all of this in order to pinpoint the fact that throughout the last half a century, Siva's role, not just as a theoretician, he hated labels being applied to him. But people now talk very frequently about scholar activists and about public intellectuals. He was all of that. And in a very practical sense, because he gave us all the confidence to believe that we had agency, particularly young, dispossessed black people. We had agency, and sometimes what the state considered to be our waywardness and the way we experienced it was essentially what the situation demanded. And some here would remember the Spaghetti House siege and what Siva was writing about that and the support that he gave to the young men involved in that particular struggle. We saw the clips about racism awareness training. That has reincarnated into what is now the latest fad, unconscious bias training. So all these years after the 1976 Race Relations Act and all of those other bits of equality legislation which were intended to protect our rights, after all of those years, it is being suggested that the racism that we experience in our schools, in universities, in our workplaces, have got to do not with racism, but with some unconscious bias that people have and have not weaned themselves from. And it relates not just to race. So it has homogenized anti-racism training, issues around gender and disability, etc., into this excrescence called unconscious bias training. It is as if no black male, no white male has any responsibility to question themselves in relation to sexism and gender oppression and the extent to which we, by our own practices and the way we are in the world, help to perpetuate the subordination of women. No white person has any responsibility anymore to own their actions and the mindset that they bring to what they do in the interface with black people, because it is unconscious. And all that does, in my view, is to demonstrate what Siva has always said, that by looking at the individual and by examining their conduct and making judgments about their conduct, we shy away from, or we deny ourselves the responsibility to understand and look at the structural and how those processes and institutions grow a culture that continues to exclude and marginalize and discriminate against target groups. So for me, whose journey started with Siva and later with the Institute of Race Relations after the plantocrats were deposed. All of those people used to turn up with their Rolls Royces to meetings of the Institute of Race Relations, and who was seeking to help the British state to recolonize us as that reserve army of labor who had been invited to come here and help repair Britain. They who wanted to recolonize us and keep issues of class away from an understanding of our condition. The coup that got rid of that lot of plantocrats and issued a new purpose and vision for the Institute of Race Relations changed for all time the way in which we conceived of racism, the way in which we conceived of the state's collusion with and perpetuation of racism, and what we ourselves could actually do about it through our agency, whether it be as school students, university students, workers in any part of the employment market, or in our cultural practices and industries. And for that, we will owe and always owe a huge debt to Siva as the builder, and to all of those, Hazel and Liz and Jenny and Francis, Colin, who have kept that movement tight, purposeful, not inflexible, responsive to what is going on globally. So that distinction Siva enabled us to make between globalization and all of what it means and globalism is something which still too many people on the left fail to understand and fail to frame the responses that they make to our condition, especially given Brexit and all that has happened since.
Nowhere is Siva, the visionary and builder, more vividly alive today than in the pages of the journal he founded, Race and Class. And I assume you all are subscribers, yes? If not, after today, I'm sure you will want to be subscribers. The function of knowledge is to liberate, he declared in its first editorial in April 1974, to apprehend reality in order to change it, end quote. As conceived by Siva, Race and Class, the Journal for Black and Third World Liberation, would be a hub for, quote, insurgent academics everywhere to dissect the racist structures of capitalism and to document struggles against racism in Britain and the West, as well as the anti-imperialist momentum gathering force in what was then called the Third World. And it would do more. It would provide tools to further those struggles, transforming knowledge into action. Always, for Siva, quote, the people we are writing for are the people we are fighting for. He described the newly transformed Institute of Race Relations with its newly transformed journal as a way station that put gas in the tanks of revolutionary movements. So in its first decade, the journal became a hub for scholar activists who were either personally involved in the struggles they were writing about or were in solidarity with those struggles. People like Basil Davidson, Iqbal Ahmed, Edward Said, John Berger, Jan Kourou, and some who are in this room today. Through their contributions, his own path-breaking articles, and the indefatigable work of co-editor Hazel Waters and the staff of the IRR, Siva built a journal that explored the symbiotic connection between racism and imperialism, put local anti-racism battles in a global context, and reclaimed histories of struggle that have been lost from view in order to strengthen communities of resistance. In its second decade, when revolutionary movements were faltering, the journal pivoted to deal with new realities, and in so doing, to use Siva's phrase, to catch history on the wing. And from the start, Race and Class had embodied Siva's feel for imperialism as a lived experience of the formerly colonized. The acceleration of globalization tied to the technological revolution required it to analyze the impact of a new economic order on workers everywhere. What would their lived experience be in the Silicon Age? In penetrating special issues, Race and Class examined the plunder of the Third World engendered by the new conquistadors and the way racism was manipulated to disguise the extent to which in which capital, untethered by place, has linked the fates of peoples around the globe and stratified them along class lines in a global social apartheid. Siva's uncanny ability to decipher the shape of things to come gives a unique staying power to prodigious pieces he wrote in the closing decades of the 20th century. Among them, you've heard Rat and the Degradation of Black Struggle, New Circuits of Imperialism, The Hokum of the New Times. Early in the 21st century, after some 120 issues, Race and Class signified its readiness to confront the widening inequalities and xenoracism, to use Liz Fekite's term, which were spawned by the march of market forces, by becoming, quote, a journal on racism, empire, and globalization. And in so doing, it remains motivated by the visceral sense of injustice that has since the beginning made it such a dynamic force. Now, I want to close on a personal note. In the 1980s, I was one of the IRR crew at what I think of as the universities at Pentonville Road and Leek Street. And I recall vividly those days when staff and friends involved in grassroots activity would gather around the lunch table to feed both ourselves and the creative processes set in motion by Siva, out of which some of his seminal works emerged. If I ever have an opportunity to be on Desert Island Disc, does that still exist? Yeah, okay. I would ask to take to my island the archive of Race and Class, the better to ponder why things are as they are and what it will take to build a different future. Siva's poetic sensibility and exquisite writing would assuage the need for a book of poetry. Of course, rising seas may curtail my reading time, but maybe not. With a predatory capitalism poised to despoil the entire planet, the words Siva penned 30 years ago have the power to inspire new generation of activists. Quote, "We have cultures of resistance to create, communities of resistance to build, a world to win," end quote. And I trust that the journal Siva built, that is now 44 years old and still going strong, will signpost them on their way. Thank you.
That was very beautiful and a tribute to the journal that we will all very much appreciate. And I think now what we should do is have a roundtable discussion. And unless you want to come up here, do you? You do? Khalid does. I'll ask Khalid Salimi, who is the elder in the sense of the person who's known Siva's longest of the people who are visiting us from Europe today, and he'll talk about his experience first, and then we'll discuss it.
Siva the Builder. I'm trying to bring in another perspective from Norway, and I'm just imagining when we started to struggle against racism for 40 years ago, back in the 70s. There are two sentences which are used frequently when it comes to Siva. That is, the heart is where the struggle is. And the other is, the black is a political color. I think these two sentences have actually taught us very much in Norway. Imagine the context there. A society of around 5 million, and they simply don't believe that racism can ever exist in that country. Racism is a problem in the South Africa or in the States. But when the new migration, and despite the fact that there has been indigenous minorities from the time immemorial, and they simply did not count. The discrimination against them was never mentioned until recently. And it's only the new migration from the 70s, when people from the South started coming, that we started being visible, because we were not up in the North, forgotten communities. We were actually washing the floors of the parliament, of the power structure, the base there. So we were visible. So they couldn't simply deny our existence. What happened is that we see the 70s scenarios where organizations like Organization Against Detrimental Migration come up, organization which has only one manifesto, and that is to sterilize the adopted children. And the mainstream politics also getting parties in the parliament which simply believe that they cannot accept any non-white immigrant anywhere in the structure. This is where we started actually building our struggle in Norway. And we learn that the heart is where the struggle is. Because everybody put heart in that struggle, and we saw around, and that we were just young people, black and white, women and men, from minorities, from a majority, etc. And we had been just learning 3-4 things from Siva, without Siva actually taught us. He never taught us that we should be consistent, but we learned from him that we should be consistent. He never taught us that we should be having a belief in this struggle on a long-term basis, but we learned from him that we should actually be believing in it on a long-term basis if we really want to do something. So after 40 years, we see the result of it, that anti-racist struggle in Norway is something which the power basis simply cannot ignore. The other point which I wanted to make was, which I just said, black as a political color. Now, in the 70s, when we started working against racism, we were told that you cannot be victim of racism because racism is not here, and you people are not even black. So my employee told me that, for God's sake, don't tell me that you are black. You are not black. You know, and a Pakistani worker is sitting beside an Indian worker, and they are talking very loud, because this is what they used to do back in the countries. So the policeman comes there and just say that, you Pakis, don't talk that loud. And this Indian guy says that, I'm not Pakis, I'm Indian. So we actually started in an atmosphere where it was very, very difficult to point out that racism was a problem. And the solution was that make people believe, those who are the victim of racism, that it is in the unity, in the solidarity, actually we can win. So we managed to have black people of all shades in the struggle, so that it could be visible and we could tell that there is a solidarity which is the base of it. So Siva actually, without telling us, very directly taught us very much of these things, which actually have helped to build the struggle against racism in Norway today. Thank you, Siva. Thank you, Institute of Restoration. Thank you so much, Siva. We love you. Once in love, always in love. We always love you. Thank you.
Can anybody hear this? I just wanted to ask Biplab and Luke whether you've had similar experiences as Khalid described, the way those are the issues that you would take into the context in which you work.
Yes, thank you, Jenny, and thank to the organizers. Yes, I came to know Siva in, I think, 92 or 93, when we already were organized in a group called Anti-Racist Initiative. And after my experience, after I came to know Siva, I realized that it's racism at the base of the problems we were talking about, and not what till then in Germany was termed as anti-foreigners feeling or anti-aliens feeling. So we realized that our struggle has to be anti-racist. And it continued, and today I am with an organization which I co-founded. It's called Reach Out, as a victim support organization, victims of racial violence. And we still have a couple of things which we had learned from Siva, which we still continue practicing. One is, a very important thing is that what he always said, we have our passports on our faces. And this we try to transmit. And the second most important thing is that we still do not practice what he criticized very strongly, so-called anti-racist education to people who are not to be educated in that way. So we do not practice that. What we do is we try to bring our protest on the streets, and that way we try to bring racism, anti-racism, and in that way institutional and structural racism is something which I must say we all have learned from Siva.
I remember we invited Siva and the Institute to Brussels. We were members of a Maoist party in Belgium,
And I remember Siva had back pain and he couldn't come, and he sent Fekete to Belgium to represent him. We did a tour to give little conferences in Belgium. Afterwards, we sent our youth delegation to the Institute to learn from them. Well, just to tell also young people that the Institute, and Sivanandan in particular, of course, his thoughts were very known in Europe and very well appreciated as one of the most important anti-racist organizations, not only in the UK, but also on the continent. And also to say that the thought of Sivanandan was very important to the radical left, and in particular as well to criticize the racism amongst what I call the white left. I think he had a great contribution to fight this still existing tendency amongst the white left. I think it's important to underline. Well, for me, as being a member of a Maoist party, when I think of Siva, I think he liked Chinese quotes or quotes from Mao. And I would like to say just one quote from Mao Zedong for Siva, saying, "All men are alike, but the death of some is lighter than a goose feather, and the death of others is weightier than the Mount Tai." The death of Siva is weightier than the Mount Tai, I think. Not only because we are making tribute to a man, but to a visionary thinker, well, not a practitioner like Jenny said, but a practitioner of revolution. That's one thing. I think through Siva we pay honor to the poor peasants and their children Siva taught in Sri Lanka. I think through Siva we pay honor to all the workers who fought in the factories against underpayment, against racism. We pay honor through Siva to all the young people who fought racist police. And we pay honor to this institute he created and who continues to transmit his work and his ideas. For me, that's why this quote from Mao for Siva is in its place. As for me, for the moment, I'm working with families of prisoners, and the spirit of Siva is still there in this sense, that when Siva analyzed the decomposition and the fragmentation of the old industrial working class into something that was fragmentized and dispersed, he said we have to take the qualities of the old industrial working class into the communities of resistance. Keep their spirit of this old industrial working class of solidarity, of loyalty, of internationalism. We have to take this and cultivate this into the communities of resistance. That's why I'm trying to do now with families of prisoners who try to do, as Siva said, make a personal thing into a case into a cause into a movement. And I think that's the way forward. For me, Siva will always be presente.
Okay, Siva is all what we have heard throughout the day today. But Siva was also very naughty. In '84, when he turned 60, we were opening a small chapter against racism in Sweden. And we were having a fire by the harbor. And I thought I should tell people and we should celebrate his 60th birthday. So I went and gathered all the people and I said that let's celebrate Siva's 60th birthday. And Siva came to me and said that, stop that nonsense, you bugger. You are telling people I'm an old fart. I just didn't do anything. 2 years ago now, Jenny, and I drove with Jenny back home, and I was sitting with Siva, and I said that, Siva, look, you look brilliant today, you know, after all these years. And when I told people that I wanted to celebrate your 60th birthday, you didn't let me do that. And he said that, today you can tell the whole world how old I am, but not when I was 60.
On anything, otherwise I'll hand it to Suresh.
No, it's all right. I mean, I just wanted to say that the struggles we have in Germany as such, and we are very proud that we are at the forefront always, and there, most people would not know Siva personally in Germany. We had been able to get into Berlin 2 times or 3 times, I don't remember exactly. And he gave lectures, and what everybody appreciated was one thing, that when he started his lecture, where lots of professors also from Britain who write about racism and anti-racism, he said that racism, when we talk about it, it's emotional. It's our emotion we talk about. So don't tell me not to be emotional, because this is what mostly writers, intellectuals do, that they separate emotion from, I don't know the term, in German it's called Sachlichkeit. So they separate these two, and Siva said, no, I'm not going to do it. If you want me to give a speech, you have to accept it, that I am emotional about racism. And when I talk about racism, this is one thing. And the second thing is that we were very, very lucky that after Siva couldn't come anymore, we had Liz coming to us, and every time we invited Liz, he represented not only the Institute of Race Relations, we realized that he was representing Sivanandan too. And I'm thankful for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Brothers and sisters, friends, the racism that we face today is as murderous and discriminatory as it was yesterday and in our history. And if you look at our history of struggle of black workers and black communities, it can be described chillingly as the experience of discrimination, destitution, detention, displacement, and sometimes death. If you look at the content of racism today, not just in Britain but in Europe, one can argue that it is even more dangerous than the one we faced in the 1970s or 80s, in the 50s. I don't want to talk about my connection with Siva. I've done the obituary, and people know my respect and love for his work and for him as a person. I want to concentrate on the future, because I think the legacy is in the future, not just in the past. Let's deal with these destructive elements of racism. Discrimination, well, even the official statistics and official bodies of the government in this country agree there is racial disparity in most of civic life, suffering, and experienced by black communities, whether it's education, schooling, housing, employment, criminal justice system. In the criminal justice systems, you have a disproportionality. In other words, more black people and brown people being stopped and searched than the comparators. More people being arrested, more people being detained, more people being charged, and more people being criminalized, and more people dying in prisons and detention centers. And a growing number which is not receding. Something like 2,000 to 3,000 people have died in the last 20 years. Not a single police officer or state official has been held to account. In terms of death, since the Lawrence campaign, which some of us were involved in and coordinated, there's been about 120 racist murders since 1993. The European referendum increased the spikes of hate crimes from something like 29%. And the stable number today recorded by police is about 58,000 a year. 82% of them are against black communities, not just migrants, and not just in terms of homophobic or disability crime, etc. 82% of 58,000. Death comes in many ways. It comes not just through discrimination, racism that discriminates, but also racism that kills. And there's been battles waged on this, which I'll come into in a minute, which has been waged by families in distress and grief, beyond comprehension, beyond support, and beyond actions that you would see were humane by state officials. Despite that, the resistance created by family and communities have been remarkable. Tales of epic proportions, both in terms of suffering and in terms of victories. In terms of displacement, never mind the displacement of refugees, but the displacement of poor communities living in black-dominated areas through regeneration and cleansing programs. The displacement and uprooting through globalization and wars waged by imperial countries. Regime change in the wake of globalization has displaced thousands of people and have ended in the shores of our country and in Europe. It's a problem of epic proportion. And what has been our response? What has been the response of a government which says that it wants to treat people and has legislation which is apparently a legislation that should treat people equally through its declarations on human rights? The current framework, the European nation that houses 550 million people will only accept 41,000. 34,000 people have been killed just in the last 17 years trying to come across the Mediterranean from war-torn countries into Europe. And European governments are now influenced by far-right populist, semi-fascist agendas. In France, the Front National holds, what, dozen municipalities? There are Northern League in collaboration with Five Star Movement in Italy, and if you see their responses, just yesterday, given the crisis of refugees coming in, what do they talk about? They want to cleanse every street, every square, every piazza from migrants. In areas where there are no migrants, the fear that has been perpetuated is much violent and alarming than the ones we faced in the 70s. And I say that from experience because we were, and we had no clue the storm of racism would descend upon us through Paki bashing and nigger hunting, and I was stabbed. But we created resistance out of it. And that displacement of refugees, asylum seekers, of people from war countries also come into this country and inhabit poor social housing and live in poverty-type conditions. It's what Grenfell actually reflects. That's the context of tower blocks built and housed in the most rich parts of our country. And you know the carnage that we've seen in Grenfell. Race and class are intertwined because poverty is the new black. And if we are to develop notions of resistance, we have to look at how we build those building blocks. And I want to, in the next 5 minutes, concentrate on those, given what we've learned from Siva. My last conversation with Siva was just before Grenfell. In fact, our discussion was about Grenfell. And in the obituary, I say that if I had known he was going to die, it would have been a tearful goodbye, because I related to Siva because both of us, as we were getting old, not only were we getting stubborn, but we were getting angrier and angrier and angrier, not mellowing at the injustices that we were discussing. And I say that not only will we miss him, but it'll be good to meet him again, to reflect and reason at how we build resistance. And I quote Rumi's poem, who reminds us that in a distant world between nothingness and everythingness, there's a field and we shall meet there. Let me describe what that field of resistance is going to be and what the building blocks are going to be about. Siva, for me, was a black Marxist, and I don't want to hide that fact. And anybody who doesn't use the word Marxist should really think the method that he used and deployed. It's a critique of capitalism which is unmatched, of inequality, of destruction, of workers and humans being treated as units of labor and become protagonists in changing that system. But Siva's vision created an autonomy of black workers who would still meet in the rendezvous of victory against capitalism, but create a different passage which ensured that even post-capitalist societies would not discriminate, etc. And one of the greatest explanations that he gives is the notion of political culture rather than the cultural politics. Building that political culture is the prerequisite for building communities of resistance. It is that political culture that gives people like me, an Asian, going into a Muslim area and talking about resistance when people in those areas, like Rotherham, face daily not racial violence, but far-right incursion into towns, demonstrations after demonstrations on a monthly basis, on their doorsteps, not 2 miles away, called pedophiles, threatened with being burnt, women being spat at. And when they resist, what happens? Just like in the 70s, they get arrested and charged and criminalized. it is in that struggle that you build that resistance. It is in the struggle of Grenfell that you build that resistance at the lowest and the hardest point, because it gives you a basis of solidarity that you must reach and treat people equally and develop that strength that must exist for that resistance. So communities of resistance cannot be developed unless you build communities of solidarity. And one of the most remarkable things I've seen in the last 40 years is a week after Grenfell, seeing hundreds of organizations from the local area coming to aid of the families who've perished in that furnace. Living homes that became furnaces of death because of state neglect. That solidarity allows you to build a dialogue and engage with people. Because what's happened is the government is very quick to, and this includes sections of the Labour Party, very quick to condemn gross violations of racial violence or acts of racial violence or fascist attack. But they never challenge racism on the streets. They pander to it. They protest but pander to it. They will never explain why anti-racism is good, and they only condemn bad forms of so-called racism. In the end, that gives space to people like Nigel Farage and Donald Trump's hustlers and hucksters coming into areas and pretending to be insurgents for working class. And that engagement in those periods of solidarity is absolutely critical. Even in areas like Rotherham, when people were charged and were being categorized as pedophiles, we won because the communities came together, argued publicly for the right of self-defense, and we managed to convince an all-white jury that the Muslim black community had the right to self-defense, including using violence to protect themselves. And the jury congratulated us after victory and asked us, why aren't the police in the dock? In Rotherham, only a year and a half ago. In the heartlands of Leave campaign. The political culture allows you to cross boundaries and be inclusive. It allows you for our discussion and take on the notions of identity politics, which have crept up and created a mask on resistance. It's time we build a critique, an analysis, and a real alliance based on race and class, which takes on these new forms of identitarian politics. It allows that political culture allows to cross cultures rather than talk about political color, which is absolutely critical in the process of struggle to engage with people and begin a new dialogue on what we are for rather than what we are against. Absolutely critical to do that, to build those communities of resistance. Siva's contribution to the work that we did has been pivotal, seminal. He fueled our struggles by writing and matching fearless audacity we had on streets with his critique and analysis in the books, which legitimized our struggle, which showed to the authorities that it was absolutely critical and we had no option but to take on the racists on the streets as well as the racists in the academia and in the print journals. We have to build a table of solidarity based on resisting the current climate and rise of racism. We have no option. Otherwise, Siva's legacy becomes purely academic. And we have to build the Institute of Race Relations by supporting its leadership in the current form, as Gus has said, and making sure that it links with the actuality of struggle in our communities across Britain and in Europe. We have no choice, because not only we will see more deaths, but the right populist movements, authoritarian movements in Europe will grow stronger unless we build that alliance in a critical phase. It is absolutely vital that we look at Siva's writings from that perspective and recognize struggles that are taking place in our communities and make those struggles central in building that resistance, supporting people in Granville, supporting people that have fought on the exclusions of schools, 40 people who are fighting against police harassment and brutality in the way Gus explained. If the heart is where the battle is, then the battle must come to our hearts, so it becomes a living thing and makes us trigger for a radical change of the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suresh. That's taken us just where we needed to go. And that is the end of the event. But can I just say, apart from the fact that we'll have people at the door, hopefully collecting for future work to take Siva's legacy forward, which will be in form of probably in a book and also a website and possibly some educational project that we will have for young people. If you leave now and go into the Brockway room, which is on that side, you will be able to look at our publications. There are an awful lot of things you can take away, and also there's Race and Class there that you can subscribe to, and I think a film loop of Siva, which shows his character. But thank you very much for coming.